The Hermes bag hit the sidewalk first, followed by the woman carrying it, and Adrian Blackstone didn't even slow his stride. He was already 20 minutes late for his father's board meeting, his Italian leather shoes clicking impatiently against the marble floors of Blackstone Tower's lobby. The collision had been inevitable. She'd been moving too slowly, taking up too much space near the elevator bank with her obvious pregnancy and careful movements. Adrian barely registered her as human, just another obstacle between him and the penthouse. "Watch where you're going," he muttered, not bothering to look back as her belongings scattered across the polished floor. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will completely transform how you see redemption. Tonight, a wealthy heir, a pregnant cleaning lady, and a collision that reveals who we really are when nobody's watching. Let's continue. Adrian Blackstone III had been born into a world where people moved out of his way, where apologies flowed toward him like gravity. At 28 he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never questioned his place at the top of every hierarchy. His tailored suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, his watch more than their car. The Blackstone name opened doors, commanded respect, and bought forgiveness for any transgression. He jabbed the elevator button with manicured fingers, checking his Patek Philippe. The quarterly earnings report wouldn't present itself, and his father, CEO of Blackstone Industries, had made it clear that Adrian's promotion to VP depended on this meeting going flawlessly. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Adrian stepped inside without a backward glance. 20 floors below, Grace Williams knelt on the cold marble, carefully gathering her scattered papers with shaking hands. Each document represented hours of work, job applications, medical forms, proof of income statements for the apartment she was desperately trying to secure before her baby arrived. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required calculation. Her back ached constantly. Her ankles had disappeared weeks ago, and the weight of carrying new life while navigating a world that seemed increasingly hostile exhausted her in ways that went deeper than physical tiredness. But Grace had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something others could take from you, you had to give it away, and she never did. She worked as a night shift cleaner in this very building, invisible to the people who occupied it during daylight hours. She knew their wasteful habits, their careless luxury, the way they left behind half-eaten meals that could have fed her for days. But she also knew something they didn't. Her son wasn't just surviving in this world, he was conquering it. Dr. Michael Williams, neurosurgeon, philanthropist, and one of the youngest department heads in the city's history. Her Michael, who'd pulled himself up from nothing through brilliance and determination, who sent her money every month that she proudly never needed to use because she worked for everything she had. Her Michael, who happened to be the youngest board member of Blackstone Industries, a fact she'd never mentioned to her supervisors because she'd learned that respect earned through work lasted longer than respect borrowed through connections. Grace carefully folded the last document and placed it back in her bag. The Hermes wasn't real, a convincing replica she'd found at a thrift store because even knockoff luxury sometimes opened doors that talent alone couldn't budge. She'd been coming to submit her application for a day shift position, something that might give her more time with her baby once it arrived. The elevator chimed again. Another group of suits emerged, flowing around her like water around a stone, their conversations about market projections and acquisition deals creating a buzzing backdrop to her quiet dignity. What would you do if someone treated your mother this way? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Grace pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly. Soon, she thought. Soon this little one would arrive, and she'd have to navigate this world as a single mother, just as she had with Michael 28 years ago. But she'd done the impossible once before. She could do it again. As she walked toward the building's exit, Grace didn't notice the security camera that had captured everything, or the way the footage was already being automatically uploaded to the building's central system, the same system that would be reviewed tomorrow by the new head of security, her son Michael. 24 hours later, the marble lobby of Blackstone Tower felt different to Adrian. The quarterly meeting had been a disaster. Numbers were down, investors were nervous, and his father's disappointed silence had been more crushing than any shouted criticism. He needed coffee, needed air, needed something to wash away the taste of failure that had been coating his tongue since yesterday's humiliation. The executive cafe on the 40th floor was closed for renovations, forcing him down to the lobby-level Starbucks where he'd never set foot in his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Adrian Blackstone III, reduced to standing in line with the common employees. Grande cappuccino, extra shot, he barked at the barista, not bothering with pleasantries. His phone buzzed constantly, reporters wanting comments about Blackstone's stock dip, board members questioning his readiness for the VP position, friends suddenly too busy to return his calls. The line moved with agonizing slowness. Adrian found himself trapped between a chattering group of secretaries and an elderly maintenance worker who smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. His skin crawled with the proximity to people he'd spent his life avoiding. That's when he saw her. The same woman from yesterday, sitting alone at a small table near the window. She moved with the same careful precision, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, while the other slowly stirred a cup of what looked like plain tea. Her face was serene despite the obvious fatigue around her eyes. Something about her stillness in the chaos of the busy cafe irritated him. She looked content, peaceful, like she belonged here among the marble and glass that his family had built, despite clearly having no business in a place this expensive. Adrian's coffee arrived, and he started toward the elevators, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him yesterday, not with anger or resentment, but with a kind of quiet disappointment that had haunted him more than any insult could have. Maybe it was the fact that his own world was crumbling and here she sat, visibly struggling, yet somehow possessing a dignity he was rapidly losing. Or maybe he was just having the worst week of his privileged life and needed someone to blame. He changed direction and approached her table. "You know," he said, not bothering to sit, "normal people apologize when they get in the way." Grace looked up slowly, her brown eyes meeting his blue ones without flinching. There was no surprise in her expression, as if she'd been expecting this confrontation. "Normal people help when someone falls," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a subtle strength that made Adrian's jaw tighten. "I didn't make you fall. You weren't watching where you were going." The lie came easily. He'd been replaying the moment, knowing full well he'd shouldered past her without regard. "I see." Grace nodded thoughtfully, taking another sip of her tea. "And now you've come over here to make sure I understand that." Her calm was infuriating. Adrian was used to reactions, anger, tears, aggressive apologies. This woman's composure felt like mockery. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," he said, his voice rising slightly, "but showing up here with your—" he gestured vaguely at her pregnancy, "trying to guilt-trip people who actually belong here." "I work here." The simple statement stopped him mid-sentence. Grace's eyes never left his face. "Every night for 6 months, I clean the offices on floors 15 through 30. I empty your trash cans, vacuum your carpets, polish the glass you look through when you're deciding which people matter and which ones don't." The words hit like physical blows. Adrian felt heat rising in his chest, embarrassment, anger, something dangerous and unfamiliar. "So you do know who I am," he said, his voice turning ugly. "I know what you are." Grace's hand moved protectively over her belly as the baby kicked, responding to her elevated heart rate. "The question is whether you do. What do you think happens when someone who has everything meets someone who has nothing left to lose?" Share your thoughts below. Adrian's face flushed red. Around them, conversations had begun to quiet. Other patrons were starting to notice the tension, the way the well-dressed man was looming over the pregnant woman's table. "Careful," he said, leaning down so his voice would carry only to her. "You might think cleaning up after successful people gives you insight into their world, but you're still just the help, and the help can be replaced." The threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Grace's teacup trembled slightly in her hands, the first crack in her composed facade. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady as stone. "You're right," she said simply. "I am replaceable. I always have been. But you—" She looked at him with something that might have been pity. "You're about to learn that you are too." Adrian straightened, confusion flickering across his anger. There was something in her tone, a certainty that made his skin prickle with unease. "Is that some kind of threat?" Grace shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Blackstone, it's just the truth. We all answer to someone." She gathered her things with the same careful dignity she'd shown yesterday, rising from her chair with effort. Adrian watched her movements, noting the way other customers were staring now, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust, all directed at him. "Enjoy your coffee," Grace said quietly, not looking back as she walked toward the elevator. But Adrian couldn't let it end there. The week's frustrations, the board meeting disaster, his father's disappointed silence, it all crystallized into this moment, this woman who dared to speak to him as if they were equals. "Hey," he called after her, loud enough now that the entire cafe turned to watch. "You think you can threaten me? You think some night shift nobody can come into my family's building and—" Grace stopped walking, turned around. And for the first time since he'd known of her existence, Adrian saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. "Your family's building," she repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent space. "Yes, I suppose it is." She stepped back toward him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, smell the faint scent of vanilla in her perfume. "Tell me, Adrian," she said. And the use of his first name sent a chill down his spine. "What do you think happens when someone who built everything meets someone who never had to build anything at all?" Before he could respond, she was walking away again, her movements still careful but purposeful now, like a woman who'd just remembered exactly who she was. Adrian stood frozen in the middle of the cafe, surrounded by stares and whispers, with the growing certainty that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. If this story is hitting you in the chest, tap that like button. It helps us reach people who need to hear Grace's message of dignity and strength. Adrian's hands shook as he jabbed the elevator button, Grace's words echoing in his head like a curse he couldn't shake. What happens when someone who built everything meets someone who never had to build anything at all? The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. Every floor that passed brought a new wave of anxiety he'd never experienced before. Adrian Blackstone III didn't get anxious, he got even. But something about the pregnant woman's calm certainty had crawled under his skin and taken up residence there. His father's corner office dominated the northeast side of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that had always made Adrian feel like a king surveying his kingdom. Today it just reminded him how far he could fall. "You look like hell," Richard Blackstone said without looking up from his computer. At 62, the elder Blackstone had built an empire through ruthless intelligence and an ability to smell weakness from miles away. He'd been smelling it on his son for months. "I'm fine." Adrian loosened his tie, trying to shake off the feeling that he'd just walked into a trap he couldn't see. "The Peterson account is threatening to pull out," Richard continued, his fingers never pausing on the keyboard. "Stock dropped another 2 points this morning. The board is asking questions about your readiness for the VP position." Adrian slumped into the leather chair across from his father's desk. "It's temporary. Market fluctuation. Nothing we can't handle." "We?" Richard finally looked up, his gray eyes cutting through his son like surgical instruments. Son, there is no weir until you prove you can handle anything on your own. The weight of expectation settled on Adrian's shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd been carrying it his entire life, the pressure to be worthy of the Blackstone name, to justify the privileges he'd been born into, but lately it felt heavier, like the foundation beneath it was shifting. There's something else, Richard said, turning his monitor so Adrian could see the screen. Security flagged an incident yesterday, some kind of altercation in the lobby. Adrian's blood turned to ice water. On the screen was crystal clear footage of him pushing past Grace, her bag scattering, his complete indifference as she knelt to gather her belongings. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., exactly when he'd been rushing to the board meeting. "Dad, I can explain." "No need." Richard's voice carried the cold efficiency that had made him legendary in boardrooms and feared by competitors. "I've seen enough entitled rich kids destroy their families' reputations over social media scandals. We're going to handle this quietly." "Handle what? She's nobody. A cleaning lady who works in our building, who could go to the press, the blogs, whoever will listen to a story about the Blackstone heir assaulting a pregnant black woman." Richard's words cut through Adrian's protests like a blade. "Do you have any idea what that would do to our stock price? To our contracts with diversity-focused corporations?" Adrian felt the walls closing in. It wasn't assault, it was barely contact. "She's blowing it out of proportion." "Is she?" Richard clicked another tab, revealing today's cafe footage. Adrian watched himself lean over Grace's table, his posture aggressive, his voice clearly raised. Even without audio, his body language screamed hostility. The man on the screen looked like a bully. Worse, he looked weak, picking on someone vulnerable to make himself feel powerful. "Jesus," Adrian whispered. "Indeed." Richard closed the laptop with a sharp snap. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to find this woman, you're going to apologize, sincerely, and you're going to make whatever gesture of goodwill ensures her silence. A settlement, a donation to her favorite charity, whatever it takes." "I'm not apologizing to her." The words came out harsher than Adrian intended, but he couldn't take them back. Some part of him, the part that had been raised to believe his name made him untouchable, rebelled against the idea of bowing to someone so far beneath his station. Richard's expression went arctic. "Excuse me?" "She was the one who got in my way, both times. She's playing some kind of angle, maybe trying to set up a lawsuit, or—" "Stop talking." Richard's voice carried a finality that Adrian had learned to fear as a child. "You sound like every spoiled brat who's ever destroyed a family legacy through sheer stupidity." Adrian felt heat flood his face. "I'm not spoiled, I've worked for everything." "You've worked for nothing." The words hit like a physical blow. "Everything you have, every door that's opened for you, every success you think you've earned, it's all been bought and paid for by the Blackstone name. And if you think that name protects you from consequences, you're about to get a very expensive education. Have you ever had to face the truth about yourself when you weren't ready to hear it? Tell us about a moment that changed your perspective. Drop it in the comments below." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Adrian had spent his entire life seeking his father's approval, measuring his worth by Richard's rare nods of acknowledgement. To hear such brutal honesty felt like watching his identity dissolve in real time. "She said something," Adrian admitted quietly, "about answering to someone. Like she knew something I didn't." Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. "What exactly did she say?" Adrian recounted the cafe encounter, watching his father's expression grow increasingly grim. When he finished, Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What's her name?" Richard asked finally. "I don't know. Grace something. She works nights on floors 15 through 30. Richard pulled up the building's employee database, his fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Adrian watched the search results populate, feeling increasingly uneasy about his father's sudden intensity. Grace Williams, Richard read from the screen, hired 6 months ago, exemplary performance reviews. Emergency contact is. His face went pale. Oh, Adrian. What have you done? What is it? Richard turned the monitor around slowly, as if revealing the results of a terminal diagnosis. There, in the employee database, was Grace's emergency contact information. Dr. Michael Williams, Chief of Neurosurgery, Metro General Hospital. And underneath that, in smaller text that made Adrian's world tilt sideways, board member Blackstone Industries. The room went absolutely silent, except for the sound of Adrian's breathing, which had become shallow and quick. He stared at the screen, the letters swimming before his eyes as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a tsunami. Grace Williams, mother of Dr. Michael Williams. Dr. Michael Williams, who controlled 43% of the board votes that would determine Adrian's promotion to VP. Dr. Michael Williams, who had the power to destroy everything Adrian had ever worked toward with a single conversation. "Dad," Adrian whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "What do I do?" Richard Blackstone looked at his son with something that might have been pity, or might have been disgust. "You pray," he said simply, "that you haven't already lost us everything." The Metro General Hospital boardroom felt like a mausoleum at 7 a.m. Adrian had barely slept, spending the night researching Dr. Michael Williams, 34 years old, youngest department head in the hospital's history, pioneered 3 revolutionary surgical techniques, recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship for Medical Innovation. And Grace Williams' son. Adrian's throat felt like sandpaper as he took his seat at the polished conference table. The monthly Blackstone Industries board meeting was routine, usually. Today it felt like walking into his own execution. "Gentlemen," Richard Blackstone's voice cut through the morning stillness as board members filed in. "And lady," he added with a nod to Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief of staff. Adrian watched each face, trying to gauge who might already know about his encounter with Grace. The pharmaceutical executives looked bored, the real estate investors seemed focused on their phones, the healthcare representatives appeared alert but neutral. Then Dr. Michael Williams walked in. Adrian's breath caught. The man was imposing without trying to be tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from literally holding people's lives in your hands. His dark skin had the same warm undertones as his mother's, and when his eyes swept the room, they held the same intelligent depth that had unnerved Adrian in the cafe. Michael Richard stood to shake hands. "Thank you for making time. I know your surgery schedule is brutal." "Always time for Blackstone Industries," Michael replied, his voice carrying the same measured cadence Adrian remembered from Grace. "Your investments in medical research have saved countless lives." Adrian felt like an insect being studied under a microscope as Michael's gaze briefly met his across the table. Did he know? Had Grace told him about their encounters? There was nothing readable in the doctor's expression, just professional courtesy and the slightly distant focus of someone who'd been awake since 4 a.m. saving lives. "Before we begin," Richard said, "I'd like to address some recent personnel matters. It's come to my attention that we may have had some incidents involving building security and employee relations." Adrian's palms began to sweat. Around the table, board members shifted in their seats with the kind of alert attention that meant someone was about to get thrown under the bus. "Incidents?" Dr. Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Michael's phone buzzed softly. He glanced at it, and something flickered across his face, concern, then anger, then a carefully controlled neutrality that was somehow more terrifying than rage. "Excuse me," he said quietly, holding up the phone. "I need to take this. It's from my mother." The room went dead silent. Adrian felt every pair of eyes turn toward him as the pieces clicked into place for the other board members. Michael stepped into the hallway, his voice a low murmur through the glass walls. Adrian, Richard's voice carried a warning that was barely masked by professional courtesy. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the board what Dr. Williams might be discussing with his mother. Adrian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Through the glass, he could see Michael pacing, one hand pressed to his forehead, his free hand gesturing with the controlled intensity of someone trying very hard not to lose his temper. There was a misunderstanding," Adrian began, but his voice cracked on the words. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Dr. Chen's voice was sharp now, her medical training making her attuned to evasion and lies. Before Adrian could answer, Michael returned to the room. His professional mask was back in place, but there was something different in his posture, a coiled tension that made Adrian think of a surgeon preparing for a particularly dangerous operation. "I apologize for the interruption," Michael said, taking his seat. His eyes found Adrian's and held them with laser focus. "My mother was calling to tell me about an incident she had in this building. Yesterday and the day before, actually." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She wanted me to know," Michael continued, his voice perfectly controlled, "that she'd been physically knocked down by someone in the lobby, and then verbally confronted and threatened in the cafe when she tried to quietly handle the situation." Richard closed his eyes as if in pain. The other board members turned to stare at Adrian with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. "She was very specific about not wanting to cause trouble," Michael went on. "She made me promise not to do anything rash, said she understood that sometimes people have bad days, and that everyone deserves a chance to make things right." Adrian felt like he was drowning in plain sight. "Dr. Williams, She described the person who did this," Michael interrupted softly. "Young man, expensive suit, acted like he owned the building. Pushed past her when she was trying to get to the elevator, knocked her belongings everywhere, didn't even slow down. What would you do if you were Dr. Williams in this moment? How do you handle someone who hurt your family? Let us know in the comments." The silence stretched until Adrian thought he might scream from the pressure of it. Finally, Michael leaned back in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table. "The interesting thing," he said, "is that she didn't want to tell me who it was. Said it didn't matter, that she could handle it herself. But I looked at the building's security footage this morning." Adrian's world tilted. You have access to security footage?" Michael's smile was razor thin. "I sit on the board of directors, Mr. Blackstone. I have access to whatever I need to protect this company's interests, and right now our biggest liability appears to be sitting right across from me." The pharmaceutical executives were whispering among themselves. The real estate investors looked like they were calculating the cost of association with a scandal. Dr. Chen was taking notes with the focused intensity of someone building a case. Michael Richards' voice was carefully controlled. "I think there may be room for discussion here. Perhaps we could—" "Oh, there's definitely going to be discussion," Michael replied, never taking his eyes off Adrian. "You see, gentlemen, I have a problem. My mother, the strongest, most dignified woman I've ever known, was assaulted and threatened in a building where she works, where she's been nothing but professional and hard-working for 6 months." Adrian tried to find his voice. "I didn't assault. Security footage says otherwise." Michael's interruption was surgical in its precision. "It shows a man using his size and privilege to intimidate a pregnant woman. Twice." The room was so quiet Adrian could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "But here's what makes this really interesting," Michael continued, pulling out his phone. "My mother doesn't know I'm on this board. She's never asked me for favors, never wanted special treatment. She takes the bus to work every night, and cleans up after people who wouldn't notice if she disappeared tomorrow." He turned the phone so everyone could see the screen, a text message thread. "This morning she sent me this. Pray for that young man Michael. He's lost, and losing people do terrible things, but everyone deserves a chance to find their way home." Adrian stared at the message, feeling something crack inside his chest. After everything, the collision, the threats, the humiliation, Grace Williams was telling her son to pray for him. "So here's what's going to happen," Michael said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd spent his career making life and death decisions. "Mr. Blackstone is going to explain to this board exactly what kind of man we're considering for a VP position. And then we're all going to decide whether Blackstone Industries is the kind of company that promotes people who assault pregnant women." Adrian looked around the table at faces that had once shown him automatic respect. Now they watched him like he was a specimen they were trying to identify, something potentially dangerous that needed to be handled carefully. He was trapped in a room with the one person who had every reason to destroy him, forced to account for actions he'd never thought would have consequences. And somewhere across the city, Grace Williams was probably getting ready for another day of work, having spent her morning praying for the man who'd pushed her down and threatened her job. The irony was so sharp it cut. "I think," Michael said, setting his phone face down on the conference table, "before we proceed, everyone should understand exactly who Grace Williams is." Adrian watched helplessly as Michael's fingers interlaced, the gesture somehow more intimidating than any aggressive posture could have been. Around the table, the other board members leaned forward with the focused attention of people sensing a story that would change everything. "My mother was 17 when she had me," Michael began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd learned to turn pain into purpose. 17, alone and working 3 jobs to keep us fed. The father, my biological father, was the son of a wealthy family who made it very clear that acknowledging his mistake would cost him his inheritance." Richard Blackstone's face went ashen. The parallels weren't lost on anyone in the room. "She could have gone to the press," Michael continued, "could have demanded support, made threats, tried to force his hand. Instead, she disappeared, moved across the country, took his name off my birth certificate, and raised me on dignity instead of daddy's money." Adrian felt like he was watching his own future being written in real time, a cautionary tale about what happened when privilege met consequence. "Do you know what it's like?" Michael asked, his eyes finding Adrian's, "to watch your mother come home from cleaning office buildings at 6 in the morning, exhausted and aching, only to turn around and go to her day job at a diner? To see her feet bleed from standing for 18 hours straight, but still help you with homework because education was the only gift she could afford to give." The room was so quiet Adrian could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "She never complained, never talked about what she'd given up, what she could have had if she'd chosen differently. But I knew." Michael's voice caught almost imperceptibly. "I knew she'd sacrificed everything, her youth, her dreams, her chance at an easy life for my future." Dr. Chen set down her pen, her expression soft with understanding. The pharmaceutical executives looked uncomfortable, probably thinking of their own children's privileged lives. "By the time I was 10, I understood that everything I would ever achieve would be built on her sacrifice. Every grade, every scholarship, every opportunity, it all traced back to a 17-year-old girl who chose the hard path because it was the right one." Michael pulled out his wallet, extracting a worn photograph. He passed it around the table, a young Grace in a hospital cafeteria uniform, holding a small boy in a graduation cap that was clearly too big for him. "High school valedictorian," Michael said as the photo reached Adrian's trembling hands. "She missed her own graduation ceremony because she was working a double shift to pay for my college application fees." Adrian stared at the photograph. Grace looked impossibly young, her smile radiant despite the obvious exhaustion around her eyes. The little boy Michael beamed up at the camera with the kind of joy that came from a mother's unwavering belief in his potential. "I got into Harvard Medical School," Michael continued, "full scholarship. The day I got the acceptance letter, she cried for 3 hours, not because she was proud, though she was, but because she finally believed the sacrifice had been worth it." The photograph felt heavy in Adrian's hands. He tried to reconcile this image of young Grace with the woman he'd dismissed as nobody, as just the help. She put herself through night school while I was in college, Michael went on. Got her GED at 35, then an associate's degree in business administration. Not because she needed it for work, but because she wanted to understand the world I'd be entering. She wanted to be able to talk to me about my career, to offer advice that went beyond work hard and be kind. Have you ever realized that someone you underestimated was actually extraordinary? Share a story about someone who surprised you. We'd love to hear it in the comments. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Michael, I think we all understand that your mother is a remarkable woman. Do you? Michael's interruption was sharp enough to cut glass, because yesterday your son treated her like garbage, not just once, but twice, and when she tried to handle it with dignity, he threatened her job. Adrian found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I didn't know. You didn't know what? That cleaning ladies are human beings? That pregnant women deserve basic courtesy? That actions have consequences? Michael's composure finally cracked, revealing the fury he'd been controlling. Or did you just not know that some of us climb out of poverty and end up in positions to hold entitled brats accountable? The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Adrian felt every career aspiration, every assumption about his protected status, crumbling like a house of cards. She called me this morning, Michael said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous calm, not to complain, not to ask for revenge. She called to tell me she was worried about you. Adrian's head snapped up. What? She said you looked lost, desperate, like someone carrying more weight than they knew how to handle. Michael leaned forward. She wanted to make sure I understood that hurt people do hurtful things, and that maybe you deserved a chance to be better than your worst moment. The conference room felt like it was spinning. Adrian couldn't process the idea that Grace, after everything he'd done, was advocating for him. But here's the thing about second chances, Michael continued. They have to be earned. And earned means understanding not just what you did wrong, but why it was wrong. It means facing the real consequences of treating people like they're disposable. Michael stood up, walking to the wall of windows that overlooked the city. From this height, people looked like ants, tiny, insignificant, easily ignored. My mother has been cleaning your messes for 6 months, he said without turning around. Emptying your trash, polishing your fingerprints off glass, making your world pristine, while remaining completely invisible to you. She's been pregnant and working nights, because day shift positions are reserved for people who look like they belong in buildings like this. Adrian felt something breaking inside him. Not just embarrassment or fear, but something deeper. A recognition of how completely he'd failed to see the humanity in someone who'd been taking care of him without his even knowing it. She's due in 2 months, Michael said, finally turning back to face the room. 2 months, and she's still scrubbing floors because she's too proud to ask for help, and too invisible for anyone to offer it. The silence that followed was deafening. So here's my question for this board, Michael said, returning to his seat with the fluid grace of someone completely in control. What kind of company are we? And what kind of man do we want representing us? Adrian stared at his hands, the photograph of young Grace and her son still clutched in his fingers. He thought about all the nights she'd been in his office, cleaning up after his careless messmaking, and he'd never once wondered about her life, her story, her dreams. He'd never wondered if she was someone's whole world. The boardroom had cleared out 20 minutes ago, but Adrian remained frozen in his chair, still clutching the photograph of Grace and young Michael. The other board members had filed out in uncomfortable silence after Michael announced he needed time to consider the appropriate response to Adrian's behavior. Richard had left without a word, his disappointment hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Only Michael remained, standing by the windows, his silhouette dark against the morning sky. Dr. Williams, Adrian began, his voice hoarse. She keeps a picture of you in her locker. The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. What? Michael turned from the window, his expression unreadable. My mother. In her employee locker downstairs, she has a picture of me at my medical school graduation, a prayer card from our church, and a newspaper clipping from when you won that sailing competition 2 years ago. Adrian stared at him in confusion. I don't understand. She cuts out articles about the Blackstone family, not because she's obsessed or anything weird like that, Michael said, walking back toward the table, but because she says it helps her understand the people whose spaces she takes care of. She wants to do good work, and she thinks knowing about their lives makes her better at her job. The room felt like it was tilting. Adrian tried to process the idea that Grace had been following his achievements, caring about his success, while he'd never even noticed her existence. She knew you'd won a sailing trophy before she knew your name, Michael continued, sitting back down across from Adrian. She knew you'd graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, knew about your volunteer work with the Children's Literacy Program, which she loved, by the way, because she says education saved both our lives. Adrian's throat felt like sandpaper. She knew about the literacy program. She was proud of you. Michael's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. This woman you dismissed as just the help was genuinely proud when she read that the Blackstone heir was using his privilege to help kids learn to read. The irony was so sharp it was physically painful. Grace had been rooting for him, believing in his potential for goodness, while he'd been treating her like she was invisible. Why are you telling me this? Adrian whispered. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the polished table. Because she asked me to. What? When she called this morning, after she told me what happened, she made me promise something. Michael pulled out his phone, scrolling to what appeared to be a voice message. She said, Michael baby, if you ever meet that young man, you tell him about the good things. Tell him I see the good in him, even if he can't see it himself right now. Adrian felt tears burning behind his eyes. I don't understand why she would after what I did, because that's who she is. Michael's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain. She's spent her whole life looking for the light in people, even when they can't find it themselves. Especially then. Adrian looked down at the photograph still in his hands, young Grace's radiant smile, little Michael's joy, the love between them so obvious it was like looking into the sun. She raised me to believe, Michael continued, that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, that cruelty usually comes from pain, and pain can be healed if someone cares enough to try. I threatened her job, Adrian said, his voice breaking. I stood over her table like some kind of bully and threatened the work that feeds her family. Yes, you did. Michael's honesty was brutal but somehow not cruel, and she went home and prayed for you anyway. The tears Adrian had been fighting finally broke free. He pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders shaking with the weight of shame and something else, something that felt like the first genuine emotion he'd experienced in years. I'm sorry, he choked out. God, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. Michael was quiet for a long time, watching Adrian fall apart with the clinical observation of someone who'd seen people break and rebuild themselves in hospital rooms. She's working tonight, Michael said finally. Building maintenance shifts start at 11 p.m. Floor 27. Adrian looked up, his eyes red and swollen. What are you saying? I'm saying my mother is one of the strongest people I know, but she's also 7 months pregnant and exhausted. She's been picking up extra shifts to save money for when the baby comes, which means she's been cleaning 30 floors instead of her usual 15. Michael stood up, straightening his tie with practiced efficiency. I'm saying that if someone wanted to actually apologize, not just say sorry but show it, they might start by figuring out how to make her work easier instead of harder. What do you think true apology looks like? Is saying sorry enough, or does change require action? Drop your thoughts below. Adrian wiped his face with the back of his hand. You're giving me a chance. I'm giving you rope, Michael corrected. Whether you hang yourself with it or use it to climb out of the hole you've dug, that's up to you. Michael walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Adrian. Yes? She's not just pregnant. The baby, it's not planned. The father took off when she told him. She's doing this completely alone, at 45 years old, starting over again. The words hit Adrian like a sledgehammer. He thought about Grace's careful movements, her quiet dignity, the way she'd protected her belly during their confrontation. She could have retired by now, if she'd made different choices, 34 years ago, Michael said. Could have had an easy life paid for by someone else's family money. Instead, she's mopping floors and saving every penny for a baby she'll raise the same way she raised me, with more love than money, more dreams than resources. Michael opened the door, then looked back one last time. Don't make me regret this, Adrian. She's been hurt by enough rich boys who thought she didn't matter. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Adrian alone with the photograph and the weight of a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. He sat there for another hour, memorizing every detail of young Grace's face, trying to reconcile that hopeful mother with the woman whose quiet strength had shaken his entire world. When he finally stood up, Adrian Blackstone III had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to learn how to deserve Grace Williams' faith in him, even if it took the rest of his life. This mother's sacrifice deserves to be shared. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone has a story worth knowing, because the next one will change how you see the world. Adrian had never been on the 27th floor. At 11:47 p.m., the familiar corporate landscape looked alien in the dim emergency lighting, shadows stretching across empty cubicles like fingers reaching for something just out of reach. He'd spent the day planning his approach, researching cleaning supply companies, calculating the cost of upgrading equipment, drafting an apology that had gone through 17 revisions. But standing here now, listening to the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner, all his preparation felt hollow. The sound came from the northeast corner, near the accounting department. Adrian followed it, his expensive shoes silent on the carpeted floor. As he got closer, he could hear something else soft humming, a melody he didn't recognize, but that somehow sounded like a lullaby. Grace was there, moving slowly between the cubicles with an industrial vacuum that looked like it weighed more than she should be lifting. Her movements were even more careful than before, one hand frequently pressing against her lower back, the other guiding the machine with practiced efficiency. She was beautiful. The thought hit Adrian like a physical blow. Not beautiful in the polished, artificial way he was used to, the women at charity galas with their strategic highlighting and designer gowns. Grace was beautiful in the way that sunlight was beautiful, or the way his grandmother's garden had been beautiful before she died, natural, essential, real. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wore the same uniform as all the cleaning staff, navy blue polo shirt and matching pants, but somehow she made it look dignified, professional. Grace? She looked up, and for a moment her face showed pure surprise. Then something else flickered across it, not fear, but a kind of resigned wariness that was somehow worse. Mr. Blackstone, she turned off the vacuum, the sudden silence feeling heavy between them. It's very late? Is everything all right? The formal politeness in her voice was like a knife to his chest. After everything that had happened, she was still trying to maintain professional courtesy. I came to apologize, Adrian said, then immediately felt like an idiot. Of course he had. Why else would he be here? Grace nodded slowly, her hand moving to rest on her belly in what Adrian was beginning to recognize as an unconscious protective gesture. That's very kind of you, she said carefully, but it's not necessary. I understand you were having a difficult day. The gracious response only made him feel worse. No, it is necessary. What I did both days was inexcusable. Everyone makes mistakes. Grace said, but there was something hollow in her voice now, like she was reciting lines from a script she'd memorized long ago. Adrian took a step closer, then stopped when he saw her tense slightly. "I met with your son today." Grace's entire posture changed, a flash of protective anger replacing the careful neutrality. "Michael had nothing to do with this." "I know. He was protecting you, as he should." Adrian ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling he'd maintained since college. "Grace, I know who you are now. I know what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed. I know about Michael's childhood, about everything you gave up to raise him. He told you about that." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's proud of you. So proud it practically radiates off him." Adrian found himself stepping closer again, drawn by something in her expression. "He told me you keep newspaper clippings about my family, that you are proud when you read about my volunteer work." Grace's face flushed, embarrassment mixing with something that looked like hurt. "I see. Why?" Adrian asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why would you care about what I did, when I never even noticed you existed?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Grace was quiet for so long. Adrian thought she might not answer. "Because," she said finally, "I clean your office every night. I see the books you read, the photos you keep, the thank you letters from the children in your literacy program. I see who you are when you think no one is watching." Adrian felt his breath catch. "And who am I?" "Someone who keeps a picture of his grandmother on his desk, even though it doesn't match the corporate aesthetic. Someone who has poetry books hidden behind the business journals. Someone who once fell asleep at his desk, with his head on a stack of donation requests for the children's hospital." Adrian stared at her in shock. He'd forgotten about that night, working late on the charity gala, overwhelmed by the stories of sick children, finally succumbing to exhaustion while trying to figure out how to help them all. "I know the man you can be," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've seen evidence of him every night for 6 months. That's why what happened hurt so much. Not because you knocked me down, but because I expected better from you." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Adrian felt something breaking apart inside him, all the carefully constructed barriers he'd built to protect himself from genuine emotion. "I want to be that man," he said, his voice cracking. "The one you saw in my office. I want to deserve your faith in me." Grace's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Adrian thought he saw hope flickering in her eyes. Then his phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the moment like a blade. Adrian glanced at the screen and saw his father's contact information. Without thinking, he answered. "Dad? Where the hell are you?" Richard's voice was loud enough that Grace could hear every word. "I've been calling for hours. The Peterson account pulled out. Stock dropped another 5 points. The board is meeting tomorrow morning to discuss your future with the company." Adrian felt panic rising in his chest. "I can explain." "You're damn right you'll explain. Get home. Now, we need to do damage control before this gets any worse." "I can't. I'm in the middle of something important." "More important than your career? More important than the family company?" Richard's voice turned dangerous. "Adrian, if you're not here in 30 minutes, don't bother coming home at all." The line went dead. Adrian stared at the phone, feeling the walls of his privileged world closing in around him. When he looked up, Grace was watching him with an expression of profound sadness. "Go," she said quietly. "No, wait. This doesn't change anything." "It changes everything." Grace turned away from him, reaching for the vacuum handle. "This is who you are, Mr. Blackstone. When it matters, when you have to choose, you'll always choose the money and the status and the approval of people who think I'm invisible. That's not true, isn't it?" Grace turned back to him, and Adrian saw tears glistening in her eyes. "You came here tonight because your son made you feel guilty, but the moment your real life called, you were ready to abandon this conversation like it never mattered." Have you ever had to choose between doing what's right and doing what's expected of you? How did you handle that moment? Share your story below. Adrian felt something desperate clawing at his chest. Grace, please, let me fix this. Let me prove. I don't need you to prove anything, Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. I need you to stop playing with my emotions like they're part of some rich boy's redemption story. I'm having a baby in 2 months. I'm 45 years old and starting over, and I can't afford to believe in people who only care about being good when it's convenient. She turned on the vacuum again, the mechanical roar drowning out any response Adrian might have made. But her body language said everything: shoulders set, movements deliberate, the absolute finality of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to risk it again. Adrian stood there for another minute, watching her work, feeling like he was watching the best part of himself disappear into the distance. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways like the sound of doors closing forever. By the time he reached the elevator, Grace had stopped humming. The elevator descended through 42 floors of disappointment, each passing level marking another degree of Adrian's descent into the life he'd always known, comfortable, predictable, and utterly hollow. His father was waiting in the lobby, pacing like a caged predator in his perfectly pressed suit despite the late hour. Richard Blackstone had built empires by knowing exactly when to cut losses, and the look on his face suggested Adrian had become a liability worth abandoning. "Get in the car," Richard said without preamble, gesturing toward the black town car idling outside. "We have exactly 6 hours to figure out how to save what's left of your future." Adrian followed numbly, his mind still replaying Grace's words, "I can't afford to believe in people who only care about being good when it's convenient." The truth of it sat in his chest like a stone. The car pulled away from Blackstone Tower, carrying him toward the family estate in the hills, where crisis management sessions had been conducted for 3 generations. Adrian watched the building shrink in the rear window until the 27th floor was just another anonymous row of lights. "The Peterson account was the beginning," Richard said, his voice cutting through Adrian's reverie. 3 more clients have expressed concerns about the company's leadership direction. The board meeting tomorrow isn't about your promotion anymore. It's about whether you have any future with Blackstone Industries at all." Adrian turned from the window. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Dr. Michael Williams has been making calls, talking to board members about characters and corporate responsibility. He hasn't said anything actionable, nothing we could legally challenge, but he's planted seeds of doubt about your judgment." The mention of Michael's name brought Grace's face rushing back, the disappointment in her eyes when his phone rang, the resigned sadness when she told him to go. "He has every right to question my judgment," Adrian said quietly. Richard's head snapped around. "Excuse me? I said he has every right. I assaulted his pregnant mother twice. If I were him, I'd be doing a lot more than making phone calls." The car fell silent, except for the whisper of expensive tires on asphalt. Richard studied his son with the same analytical intensity he'd once used to dissect quarterly reports. "Adrian, I need you to listen very carefully," Richard said finally. "Whatever guilt you're feeling, whatever conscience-driven breakdown you think you're having, set it aside. We're talking about the survival of everything our family has built." "Maybe," Adrian said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "some things aren't worth surviving." Richard's face went white. "What did you just say?" Adrian looked at his hands, soft, manicured, unmarked by any real work. He thought about Grace's hands, calloused from years of labor, gentle when they rested on her belly, strong enough to raise a son who saved lives for a living. "I've been thinking," Adrian said, "about what kind of man I want to be, and I don't think it's the kind who runs away when his father calls." "You're having some sort of breakdown," Richard said, his voice sharp with panic. "The stress of the situation, the guilt, it's affecting your judgment." We'll get you counseling, therapy, whatever you need, but right now we need to focus on damage control." The car turned onto the winding road that led to the Blackstone estate. Adrian had driven this route thousands of times, always feeling like he was returning to safety, to the place where his name meant something. Tonight it felt like driving toward a beautiful prison. "Dad," Adrian said quietly, "what did you sacrifice to build all this?" Richard blinked, thrown by the change in direction. "What kind of question is that? You must have given up something, made choices that cost you. What did you lose to gain everything else?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the leather seat. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I met someone tonight who gave up everything, her youth, her dreams, her chance at an easy life, to give her son a better future. And she did it without ever complaining, without ever asking for recognition or reward. She just did what needed to be done. Adrian. And I realized that everything I have, everything I've ever achieved, was built on someone else's sacrifice. Yours mostly. But I never had to sacrifice anything myself. I never had to choose between what I wanted and what was right." The car pulled through the estate gates, past manicured gardens that required a team of 12 groundskeepers to maintain. Adrian looked out at the luxury that had surrounded him his entire life, and felt nothing but emptiness. "So I'm asking you," Adrian continued, "what it cost you to build this empire, because I need to know if it was worth it." Richard's composure finally cracked, revealing something raw and painful beneath. "You want to know what I sacrificed? I sacrificed having a son who actually understood the value of what he inherited. I sacrificed having a family that appreciated the security I provided. I sacrificed—" He stopped, his jaw working as if the words were too difficult to form. "What, Dad?" "I sacrificed being the kind of father who raised a son with character instead of entitlement." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was so focused on giving you everything that I never taught you what anything was worth." The car stopped in front of the mansion's main entrance, but neither man moved to get out. "It's not too late," Adrian said quietly. "For either of us." Richard looked at his son with eyes that held 30 years of regret. "What are you thinking of doing?" Adrian pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he'd programmed earlier, but hadn't had the courage to call. "If you had to choose between keeping everything you've known or gaining something real but uncertain, what would you choose? Tell us about a time you chose growth over comfort in the comments below." "I'm thinking," Adrian said, his finger hovering over Michael Williams' contact information, "about what Grace told me, that I only care about being good when it's convenient. Adrian, if you call him tonight, if you do anything that could be seen as panic or desperation." "Dad." Adrian looked up from the phone, meeting his father's eyes directly. "What if they're right? What if I am exactly as worthless as my actions suggest? What if the only way to become worth something is to lose everything I never actually earned?" Richard stared at his son, seeing something in Adrian's face that hadn't been there before, not just determination but something deeper, something that looked like integrity. "The board meeting is at 8 a.m., Richard said finally. "I know. Whatever you're planning, you have until then to figure out how to live with the consequences." Adrian nodded, pressing Michael's number before he could lose his nerve. The phone rang once, twice. "Dr. Williams." "Michael, it's Adrian Blackstone. I know it's late, but I need to ask you something." "I'm listening." Adrian took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into freefall. "I need to know how to deserve a second chance from someone who's already given me more kindness than I had any right to expect." The line was quiet for so long Adrian thought Michael had hung up. "That," Michael said finally, "is a very different question than I was expecting." "I know, but it's the only one that matters anymore." Adrian closed his eyes, waiting for judgment, rejection, or the confirmation that he'd destroyed his last chance at redemption. Instead, he heard something that sounded almost like hope. "Let's talk." The Metro General Hospital cafeteria at 6 a.m. was a symphony of quiet efficiency, nurses grabbing coffee between shifts, doctors reviewing charts over hurried breakfasts, the gentle hum of people caring for others even when they were exhausted themselves. Adrian sat at a corner table, 2 cups of tea growing cold in front of him, watching the entrance with the nervous energy of someone whose entire future hung on the next hour. He'd been there since 5:30, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the conversation he'd had with Michael until 3 a.m. "She gets off work at 6, Michael had said. "She always stops for tea before taking the bus home, always sits by the windows on the east side, where she can watch the sunrise. Will she talk to me? I don't know. But Adrian, this is your last chance. Not because I'm giving you an ultimatum, but because she won't survive being disappointed again. Not right now." Adrian checked his watch, 6:17 a.m. The board meeting was in less than 2 hours, and he still had no idea what he was going to say, how he was going to explain the choice he'd made in his father's car. All he knew was that somewhere between the 27th floor and this moment, everything had changed. The cafeteria doors opened and Grace walked in. She moved slowly, her hand pressed against her lower back, the weight of 8 months of pregnancy and a full night's work etched in every careful step. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair escaping from its ponytail, but she carried herself with that same quiet dignity that had first unnerved him days ago. She didn't see him at first, focused on the tea station with the concentration of someone whose body was running on fumes. Adrian watched her select chamomile with honey, count out exact change from a worn purse, find her usual table by the windows where morning light painted everything gold. Only then did she notice him. Their eyes met across the cafeteria, and Adrian saw a flicker of surprise, followed by something that looked like exhaustion, not physical tiredness, something deeper. The weariness of someone who'd stopped expecting good things, but wasn't quite ready to give up hope entirely. Adrian stood slowly, lifting one of the teacups, and walked toward her table. Each step felt monumental, like crossing a bridge that might collapse at any moment. "May I?" he asked, when he reached her table, gesturing to the empty chair. Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded toward the seat. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Adrian sat down carefully, sliding the second cup of tea toward her, chamomile with honey. "Like you ordered." Grace accepted the cup with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been watching me. Michael told me you come here every morning to watch the sunrise." Adrian wrapped his hands around his own cup, needing something to anchor him. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not because my career depends on it or because someone made me feel guilty, but because you deserve to hear it." Grace was quiet, her attention seemingly focused on the steam rising from her tea. "I've spent my whole life," Adrian continued, "believing that my comfort was more important than other people's dignity, that my convenience mattered more than their humanity. And I convinced myself it was okay, because I donated to charity, and volunteered with kids, and kept pictures of my grandmother on my desk." "Those things matter too," Grace said softly. "Not if they're just performance, not if they're just ways to feel good about myself, without actually changing how I treat the people in front of me." Adrian leaned forward, his voice growing more urgent. "Grace, I want to tell you something, and I need you to know it's true even if you never forgive me." She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "You are extraordinary," Adrian said. "Not because of what you've overcome or what you've sacrificed or how you raised Michael, though all of that is incredible. You're extraordinary because you see goodness in people, even when they can't see it themselves. Because you pray for people who hurt you. Because you work every night to take care of spaces where you're invisible, and you do it with more grace and dignity than I've ever shown in my entire privileged life." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. And I want to be worthy of the faith you had in me, Adrian continued. Not the man you imagined based on the pictures in my office, but the man I could actually become if I stopped hiding behind money and status and started acting like character actually matters. What does real change look like to you? Have you ever seen someone completely transform who they are? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. Grace set down her teacup with trembling hands. Adrian, what are you saying? I'm saying I'm resigning from Blackstone Industries. This morning, at the board meeting, the words came out steady, certain, despite the fact that he was announcing the end of everything he'd thought he wanted. I'm giving up my inheritance, my position, my trust fund, all of it. Grace stared at him in shock. You can't do that. Your family, your future. My future is whatever I build with my own hands, and I want to build something that would make you proud. Adrian reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough that she could feel the warmth. I've been thinking about what Michael said, about you needing help, but being too proud to ask for it. And I realized I don't want to help you because I feel guilty. I want to help you because you taught me what strength actually looks like. Grace was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process what she was hearing. There's a daycare in the building, Adrian continued, his voice gentle but certain, on the 3rd floor. It's been closed for renovations, but it could be reopened, could be staffed by people who understand what working mothers need, could be free for employees who can't afford childcare otherwise. Adrian. And there's a day shift supervisor position opening up. Better hours, better pay, health insurance that covers prenatal care and maternity leave. It's yours if you want it. Not because of Michael, not because I feel guilty, but because you're the best employee we have, and it's long past time someone recognized it. Grace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions she'd been holding back for months. Why? She whispered through her tears. Why would you give up everything for someone like me? Adrian felt his own eyes burning. Because someone like you is worth more than everything I thought I had. Because 34 years ago you chose the hard path to give your son a chance at greatness, and yesterday you chose to see the good in someone who'd given you every reason not to. He reached into his jacket, pulling out an envelope he'd spent hours preparing. This is a letter of resignation and a formal apology to be read at the board meeting. But before I submit it, I need to know, will you let me try to earn your forgiveness? Not as a rich boy playing at redemption, but as a man who wants to learn how to be worthy of the kindness you've shown him. Grace looked at the envelope, then at Adrian's face, searching for any trace of the arrogant young man who'd pushed past her 3 days ago. What she saw instead was someone she barely recognized, vulnerable, sincere, and absolutely terrified of her answer. The baby kicks every time I think about you, she said quietly, her hand moving to her belly, like they know you're important somehow. Adrian's breath caught. What does that mean? Grace smiled then, the first real smile he'd ever seen from her, radiant as sunrise through the hospital windows. It means, she said, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers, that some people are worth believing in, even when they don't believe in themselves yet. Adrian felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening onto a life he'd never imagined possible. Grace's hand was warm on his, calloused from work but gentle as a blessing. There's a board meeting in an hour, he said. I know. Everything's going to change after that. Good, Grace said firmly. Some things need to change. Adrian lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles, with the reverence of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Then let's go change them together. Outside the hospital windows, the sun climbed higher into a sky painted with promise, casting golden light over two people who'd found in each other the courage to become who they were always meant to be. And in the quiet morning air, a baby kicked with the rhythm of a heart learning how to love.
The end. What do you think? Can love really transform someone completely? Or does real change have to come from within first? Share your thoughts on Adrian and Grace's journey. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you in the comments below. This emotional journey explored themes of privilege, redemption, and the transformative power of unconditional love. Grace Williams showed us that true strength comes from dignity in the face of adversity, while Adrian Blackstone learned that real worth must be earned, not inherited. Their story reminds us that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who can teach us the most about what it means to be truly human. If you felt every emotion in this story, the next one will completely transform you. It's wilder, deeper, and more heartbreaking than you could ever expect. Your next emotional journey is just one click away. Tap that story showing on your screen now. Thank you for being part of this beautiful moment with us.